Hi, I'm David Noble and welcome to the channel. Now, I frequently talk a lot about junior series, drivers, various junior programs which are out there. Now, if you recognise these three, then, well done, you clearly know your junior formulas. And you possibly know some of what this video is about. Now, there's kind of a potential problem though, at least for two of them. You see, Mercedes has got a near perfect record for taking young drivers to Formula One. And as respectable as Frederick Vesti and Paul Aron's records are, they're by no means bad drivers, they don't quite scream future Formula One stars. As for Andrea Kimi Antonelli, he's shown serious potential, but it's a little bit too early to say at this moment, so just keep an eye out for him. Now, Mercedes haven't traditionally had an academy the size of its current setup, which generally them only backing one or two drivers at a time. But in recent years, that has meant the likes of George Russell, Esteban Ocon and Pascal Wehrlein all coming through into Formula One, giving them a pretty high success rate. But they're by no means the first drivers to reach Formula One with the help of Mercedes. Now, Mercedes returned to racing in the 1980s after an absence stretching 30 years back to the 1955 Le Mans race, where one of their cars was involved in an accident which tragically led to the death of 83 spectators and injured nearly 180 more. It was to Le Mans and the World Sports Car Championship that would return in 1985 though, powering the Sauber C8 Group C prototype. However, an accident at Le Mans would end their only outing of that year. They returned for a full campaign in 86, taking a win at the Nürburgring, which encouraged Mercedes to invest more heavily, also entering DTM during that time. Throughout the late 80s, the car and the engine improved, eventually evolving into the C9, which took the teams and drivers' titles in 89. In 1990, they and Sauber ramped up their efforts again with the Mercedes-Benz C11. Now, this might sound an odd introduction to talking about a young driver program, but bear with me. They filled two cars that year, with the number one car fielded by the experienced pair of Mauro Baldi and Jean-Louis Slesser, and a number two car headed up by Jochen Mass, with the second seat being given to a young driver. See, I'll get there eventually. Now, originally this was going to be one individual, but during test drives at Le Castellet prior to the start of the season, it was decided by the Mercedes Motorsport boss that they'd run all three of the drivers at various outings through the season. Laughter in the paddock at Mercedes' decision to put forward their young talent lasted no further than the first round, when Mass, with young teammate Karl Wendlinger, finished second at the number one of Baldi and Slesser. At the next race, though, Wendlinger's replacement unfortunately showed his experience at Silverstone. When the car broke down in qualifying, asked for help from the team, who unfortunately duly obliged, showing some of their inexperience possibly as well. Their idea of where they were allowed to work on the car and the FIA's idea of where they could work on the car were basically not on the same page, and the young Michael Schumacher's first World Championship race event would end in disqualification. At the next race in Spa, the number one car got off to a healthy lead, but an issue later on in the race dropped them back, allowing the victory to go to Mass and Wendlinger. Wendlinger was coming into the year as the reigning German F3 champion. With that win, the 21-year-old had become the youngest driver to win a World Championship sports car event since Ricardo Rodriguez won the Targa Florio in 1962. It also meant that he and Mass led the championship standings. However, because he was sharing his seat, it would be the last time he got the chance. He had one more outing later on that year, finishing a comparatively lowly ninth. Schumacher, though, had a lot to prove after his disastrous first outing, and his three remaining outings he didn't disappoint. In between winning the German F3 Championship, he'd take 2 second places and a win in the number 2 Mercedes to finish the 1990 season on a high. The third driver who tested at Le Castellet in Jerez was Heinz Harald Frentzen. He'd only get to drive one race for the team at Donington, with himself and Mass again finishing second. The following year he had returned to Formula 3000 in the hopes of impressing enough to get a Formula 1 drive, but for whatever reason F3000 just didn't work out for him. In 1991 it was all changing the regulations in sports cars, but Mercedes and Sauber were having trouble developing the C11's replacement, the C291. The new engine, which was similar in design to an F1 engine as it was a 3.5 litre V12, was kind of problematic, and the car itself was already obsolete in its design compared to cars like the Ross Brawn designed Jaguar XJR 14, which around Suzuka had been 4 seconds a lap quicker. They were changing dynamics in the team as well. Mass moved to join Slesser in the number 1 car, while Schumacher and Wendlinger became the permanent lineup in the number 2. Having won the Sports Car Championship 2 years in a row, there were discussions about entering F1 in '92, but 1991 was a rude awakening. Of the 8 starts that Schumacher and Wendlinger had that year, between the older C11 and its replacement, the C291, 5 would end in mechanical failure. Yet, strangely, 1991 was the year that made Schumacher's career. In 1991, the F3000 Jordan team had taken the step up to Formula 1 and were having an encouraging season. Midway through the year, their driver Bertrand Gachot was sentenced to 18 months in prison for aggravated assault after an incident with a taxi driver in December the following year. Eddie Jordan, needing to find a driver on short notice, contacted Michael, and with a $150,000 sweetener from Mercedes, he became a Formula 1 driver. A race later, he was signed full-time to the Benetton Formula 1 team, whilst still fulfilling his sports car duties. The sports car season ended well with victory at Autopolis in Japan, so what better way to sign off? Wendlinger would make the move to F1 at the end of '91 as well, but whereas Michael was able to make headlines, Carl found himself stuck in the back of an uncompetitive Leighton House that was kind of struggling for budget at this point. The original plan had been for Michael and Carl to join Sauber Mercedes when they joined the grid in '92, but the bruising experience of the new sports car regs in '91 had convinced team and supplier that they weren't ready, and they spent a year away developing and testing. Wendlinger therefore found himself with another year in the team he had ended 1991 with. Now called March on account of Leighton House's having pulled out, the car was effectively a lightly revised version of the previous year's car. Wendlinger struggled as a result, but a high attrition rate at the Canadian Grand Prix in Montreal saw him take a 4th place finish, giving him 12th in the Drivers' Championship. He joined Sauber in 1993 as planned, but although the team had an option on Michael, he'd chosen to stay at Benetton. Peter Sauber was frustrated, but kind of understood that Michael didn't want to trade a car he was winning races in for a new team that might take years to reach that level. Michael would eventually return to drive for Mercedes, but that wouldn't be for another 17 years. The engine used in the Sauber C12 that competed in 1993 was initially badged as an Ilmor engine. The car, designed by Harvey Postlethwaite and Leo Ress, had a checkered season, with 12 DNFs due to mechanical failure and a further 6 from driver-related issues from 32 starts. Initially, new teammate JJ Lehto got the better of Wendlinger in the early races, but by later on in the season the roles were reversed. How much of that was due to JJ leaving the team to race alongside Schumacher at Benetton for '94? Perhaps not being as invested is kind of anyone's guess. And in 1994 the engines were badged as a Mercedes, and there was the return of the third of the Mercedes Musketeers to the fold as Heinz-Harald Frentzen stepped into the vacant seat. '94 started off disastrously for Formula 1 in general though, with 3 races into the season at the San Marino Grand Prix, first Roland Ratzenberger in qualifying and then Ayrton Senna, the biggest name in the sport, both died in the same weekend. Drivers were still reeling from the shock when they turned up at the next race in Monaco. F1 didn't need a reminder of how dangerous motorsport was, but they got one. Partway through first practice, Carl Wendlinger lost control of his car exiting the tunnel. In the accident that followed, his head hit the barrier and he was knocked unconscious, but remained in a coma for several weeks. Although he tried to return to F1 in 1995, his performances weren't perhaps of the same standard they had been previously, and the team had to let him go. While his F1 dream was over, he'd still compete in DTM and FIA GT championships in the following years. But I remember the commenters saying in the early 90s, talking about Carl Wendlinger as a future star. When you look at what he did in sports cars to start off with, it's very much if fate hadn't been what it had been, what could have been different? Frentzen was a driver who should have achieved more, but it kind of seemed to need an environment he was comfortable in to be at his best, and it never really happened. Mercedes seemed not overjoyed at the lack of progress with Sauber, and they'd cast eyes further afield in 1995 and joined McLaren. The recent Schumacher documentary on Netflix even showed footage of Ron Dennis talking to Michael Schumacher about him joining the team, although how serious that was is another matter. Sauber resorted to using Ford customer engines, and it confirmed their status as a midfield team, unfortunately. In his 3 years at Sauber, he'd finished 13th, 9th and 12th, but it was enough for him to be called to Williams to replace Damon Hill in 1997. But for whatever reason, it never really gelled there. When his teammate was busy taking the championship from Schumacher, Frentzen could only finish a distant second after Michael's subsequent disqualification, with 1 win, 1 pole and 7 podiums in 17 races. Now, if you're in the strongest car and only get 7 podiums in 17 races, that's a problem. I mean, can you imagine how much stick Valtteri Bottas got as Lewis Hamilton's teammate? And Jacques Villeneuve isn't Lewis Hamilton. So, seriously underperforming. Although the car that Williams gave him in 98 was woeful, and for 99 he joined his old boss from Formula 3000, Eddie Jordan. Now, Jordan were arguably at their peak at this point, having scored a 1-2 finish in Spa the year before. The 1999 season was one of the most strange in history, with the 2 top teams seemingly taking it in turns to try and lose the championship. And sitting just behind them, within shouting distance, was Heinz-Harald Frentzen. He might even have been in with a shout of winning it, but for a misunderstanding regarding the anti-stall the meant he retired from the lead of the European Grand Prix. The victory would have put him level on points going into the closing races of the season, but instead he'd get 4 points from the remaining 2 races, which meant finishing 3rd. But still, it was the best season of his career. From highs to lows, he'd be dropped by Jordan midway through the following season and soon find himself out of F1 with an okay, I suppose, record of 3 wins, 18 podiums, 2 pole positions and 6 fastest laps from 160 starts. Considering the car he had in 1997, it probably should have been more, but unfortunately it's kind of the way it goes sometimes. He'd go on to compete in DTM and various sports car events, but his career did kind of fade out. It'd be years before Mercedes really pushed a young driver program again, but for some of that was because they were partnered with McLaren, who had their own programs in place. Several drivers, and that would later race for Mercedes in DTM, including Gary Paffett. One driver in particular would do rather well for himself racing for them in Formula 1, but I don't need to tell you who that is. As always, thanks for watching. If you have any thoughts or observations that aren't to do with Michael Schumacher's wife having previously gone out with Heinz-Harald Frentzen, then leave them in the comments. And until next time, take care. Bye-bye.